Good day and welcome at the Security Risk Management e-learning. My name is Stephen Poot and I've been training for global risk advice on the topics of security and crisis management for several years now, and I've been asked by Venro to do this e-learning. What we're going to talk about in this short e-learning of 30-35 minutes, we'll be talking about, the introduction of this program. We're going to talk about the security risk management framework your NGO could implement. And we're going to walk you through several steps of the security cycle, and I will explain a little bit more about security cycle later on. But it's about the steps you can implement within your NGO or within your local NGO to keep your staff more safe and secure. Talking about the security risk management framework, at Global Risk Advice, we use four different pillars which can help you get an idea what you can implement for your NGO. The first one is about global policies and procedures, or if you're a local or a partner organization, your national policies and procedures. The first one is the security risk management policy. That's the policy where you put in what type of organization you are, what type of risks you want to take or you think are acceptable, whose responsibilities and what are the roles for different actors within your organization, so that you have a broad overview within your organization about security risk management. The second one is the crisis management protocol, and it simply tells, as well, the rules and responsibilities, but also what is a crisis and who and when is which body or which part of the organization responding to a crisis. So it's a help for the crisis management team, if you have one in your NGO, to help in the crisis itself. Then there's a possibility of adding minimum operating security standards, which means is that you say, all right, these are the minimum requirements we have for operating in a certain area or a certain country on the basis of security. So you define the regions or the countries you're in into certain color codes. And you say, right, for example, England could be green. Another country, you say, all right, that's more yellow, it's more risky, and then orange, and then maybe red. And per color coding, you will say, all right, these are minimum operating security standards for our staff. So in the green area, you might not need satellite telephones, for example, but you will need it in the red areas. And then you have corporate SOPs. SOPs are standard operating procedures, and we will go into that a little bit later as well in this e-learning. But what you describe in your standard operating procedures are just how do we do things within our NGO? How do we do things in our organization, and which people have which task, and to what rules does our staff need to apply? Then we have the country security plans. That's the second column, and it's the security plan per country. If you're a local one, you can do that even per region or per city, depending on how big your projects are in which region of your country. There are even certain NGOs who have it almost per person or per team, because they have small medical teams, for example. They send them to different hospitals and they have to make a security plan per team. And what you will put in there is context analysis, risk assessment, risk reduction or mitigation strategies, preventive measures, and specific SOPs for that region or for that city or for that country. Contingency plans. Contingency plans are the plans of what if something goes wrong, what are we going to do? And then there is a part of incident reporting and analysis. This column it has all the steps of the security cycle, which we will talk about later, which are very important for you to make a security plan and to make it very practical for the staff you're working with or for yourself. And the third column is about information and training, because it's great to have policies and protocols in place, to have security plans in place. But if you don't manage it, if you don't talk about it with your staff, if you don't train your staff on the security measures, it's just a piece of paper laying in a drawer in the office. So the third column is about the briefing and debriefings you do. Do you brief and debrief your team or your staff when they're going into a certain area? Do you brief them on the security threats, on the things that they might encounter or might not encounter? But also, do you do a debriefing so that they can report back to you and say, all right, we didn't encounter any checkpoints, but we saw a carjack from a distance. That's a very important information as well for you as a security manager or logistic manager, or well, even just working as a staff member of an NGO, that you have that information, because maybe you do not want to take that road the next time you are there. Other part on information is also the topic of meetings. Do you have a security topic on your agenda when you talk with your team? Do you talk about the security threats your organization faced that day or faced that week? Or maybe it's just a small topic where you address a part of security in 5 or 10 minutes, which one of the staff members prepared. So sometimes you can do that in turns. You say, right, every week we have a meeting. You can add a small piece of information on safety or security. Maybe someone takes a look at the fire extinguishers. Maybe someone reads a little bit about first aid. Maybe someone does a check of all the first aid kits within the NGO and to see, are they still complete? Are they still up to date? Are they still in the places where they need to be? Another part of information is also training. Do you train your staff on personal security? And do you train them on your own protocols? And the same goes for security management. Do you train your management to implement security? Do you train them on how to incorporate security in the day-to-day business of your NGO? Or is it just something you let someone, well, one person do? When something happens with security, then you point to one person and says, they can think about it. Or do you say, no, security is the responsibility of every manager, but also of every staff member within our NGO? Well, same goes for crisis management. Do you train your crisis management team? Do you even have one who responds to the crises that are happening around your NGO? And also specific training. Do you train your guards on what to do when there is an attack, when there's a thief, when someone tries to enter? And do you also train your drivers? What do you do when you drive? What are the responsibilities you have? You have to drive defensively. How do you do this? How do you deal with checkpoints? How do you deal with officials, with authorities? And what are the rules we as an NGO have? And what can or cannot be done if we deal with checkpoints like bribery or corruption? Specific training can also be if we talk about very specific topics. For example, first aid, but also gender security. What are the differences between men and women? Which different risks do they face? And how can we help each other as staff members to deal with the different risks men and women face? And then the last part, security alerts. Do you send out alerts to your team, to the people that are working for you if something is happening? Do you have a security officer who says, every day or every week, I'm sending out an alert to the people traveling that maybe in place X, something is happening, they are going to pass place X, so they really need this information. It's very important to keep your staff up to date on security alerts, especially in the more dangerous cities, countries, regions you're working with and working in as an NGO. Then there's the fourth one, that's the governance, because you can have all the paperwork in place, you can train people, but if you don't govern and if you don't maintain this system, then within a few years it's gone, it's out of date, and all the hard work was in vain. So the first part is, do you have a duty of care? And what do you do as an organization to take care of your own staff? Do you have a code of conduct saying, do you ask them to comply to certain standards, that they comply with behavioral codes that you give them? Also, is there any global oversight, or is there a national oversight within your organization to see, all right, what are the standards we need to live up to, and do we keep them? Do people check us? Are there insurances or alarm systems or services in place? And like I said, you have to keep informing your staff and local, national, international about security. So does line management have security rules, or is it just the one person in the corner having to deal with security? Part of maintenance is also the maintenance of the policies and protocols, because they need to be updated every half year, maybe in certain regions you want to have it updated even every month. The maintenance of the policies and protocols, because the biggest problem of a policy and protocol is when there is emergency information in there and it's not correct anymore. We cannot call that phone number. The embassy moved. The hospital is not responding anymore to direct calls, for example. They have another office for this. All things you have to keep into account when you're updating your policies and protocols. Another point, which we will also talk about in the security cycle, is the incident follow-up and trauma support. If incidents happen, what do we do as an organization? How do we react? What do we provide our staff with? And do we provide trauma support? Do we provide people they can talk to? Or don't we do anything? It's good to think about which steps the NGO or your organization has and which might be or might need to be implemented. And then the last part, which I want to address with the security risk management framework, is the part of networking, because it's so important that you have local contacts which provide you with information, but that you can also share information with, you can work together with. Governments you share information with or get information from. International security organizations like INSO or GISF, who can help you get information on your local context and how to keep your staff safe. So these 4 pillars together are your security risk management framework. And it can be a lot of work. However, if you have these 4 pillars in place, you can create a security culture within your NGO. A culture where people know and are aware that security is a very important point for themselves, for others, and for also the beneficiaries they're working with, so that people change maybe their behavior to keep, well, their fellow staff members, but also themselves safe and secure. Going to the next step, we're going to talk about the security cycle, which I already addressed shortly. The security cycle is the cycle you go through for your policies and protocols, so your country security plans, but sometimes also very practical if you have your travel preparations. It's a step of, first you do your context analysis. So you're going to look at who am I and where am I? When I know that, I can look at the risks. What are the risks I'm going to face when I go into this context? Then the next step will be, all right, if I know my risks, how am I going to mitigate them? How am I going to deal with the risks I'm facing? The next step then goes into developing your standard operating procedures. So it's not only what am I going to do to mitigate the risks, but also what do we do as an organization? What do we have in place? But also what do we expect from our staff members? You can all write that down in your SOPs. Then the next step is you go to contingency planning. So what if something goes wrong? What are we going to do then? And then the last part is, all right, if something happens, we have to report the incidents, because we have to learn from it. That's why the last arrow is there. Because if we learn from our incidents, if we monitor the things we do and we report our incidents, then we can go back to our context analysis and adjust it and see where our risks are and what they are. So going into context analysis very shortly, it's the question, who are you and where are you? So the who are you? It's what is your mission? What is your mandate? But also how are you organized? Are you very top down? Are you down up? Are you part of an international NGO? Are you a local NGO? Are you a partner organization? Are you partnering with other people? Are you related to certain, well, maybe even governments or other NGOs? But also, are you related to some donors? And what are the wishes of those donors? Also, what are the vulnerabilities of who I am, who our organization is? Because there is a big difference between NGOs, how they are perceived. Are they local? Are they otherwise international? And then you or your organization moves to the where. So where are you? Which context are you in? And then you're going to look at politics, economic, social, technological, legal, environmental, and it can be much, much bigger. That you look to the context and see, who am I and where am I? A part of context analysis is not only the who are you and where are you, but also who are the others? Who are the other actors in this environment? We call this actor mapping. This is a small image of how you can do it. But actor mapping, you're going to put on a paper, and it would be great if you do this with your colleagues, to write down all the actors you see in the country, the region, the city you are in. And please, with context analysis, it's of extreme importance that you incorporate all your staff and let them share. Because we tend to do this as one person doing the actor mapping, putting it in a country security plan or in another security policy, and that's it. But we need the information other people give. So it's not only the manager, it's not only the director, it's also maybe the driver or the PR consultant or the IT manager. People have very different views on life, and we need them all to create the best context analysis we can. So we put my NGO in the middle, and then we're going to look for actors, and that can be NGOs, that can be governments, that can be religious movements, that can be ideological movements, that can be tribal, that can be groups of certain ethnicity, that can be, in this case, the army, the police, certain ministries, Ministry of Internal Affairs, External Affairs, major donors, external forces within your country. There are a lot of actors working in your context. And then the next question becomes, after we mapped all the actors, but what are the relationships between us? So maybe with the NGO 1, I have a good relationship, and with the UN, but maybe with the NGO 2, not. And well, as you can see in this case, the army has a dotted line, so sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. And then the next step might even be, can we say something about the relationships they have between them? Because if I have a good relationship with NGO 1 and not with NGO 2, but NGO 1 and 2 have a very good relationship together, well, maybe I can ask NGO 1 to help me to get in a better connection with NGO 2. Or maybe I have a good relationship with the UN, but I'm struggling with my relationship, in this case, with the army. Well, maybe I can find someone at the UN who can assist us or help us to have stronger governmental ties if we need them. Because at the end, we need a context analysis before we can even go to a risk assessment. You cannot do a risk assessment if you do not know your context, because the threats I'm facing in Europe or in the Middle East are vastly different. So we need to know our context before we can even go to risks. So if we know our context, then we can also decide on our security policy in how we want to strategically go into this new context we're facing. There are several security strategies, and sometimes an organization already has a strategy before they go into a new context. And sometimes you first look at the context, and then you're within the organization, people are going to discuss what strategy do we want to use when we go into this new context. The first one is acceptance. Your security comes from the local people or the local region accepting your presence there because you're doing a good job. Maybe you provide clean drinking water, medical aid, education, and people love this. And that's why you're protected, because people need you there. They want you there, so people will not attack you or drive you out. Another security strategy is protection. And to a certain extent, we all use protection. We lock our doors, maybe build a wall, maybe use barbed wire, and we can do that until we hire guards or armed guards. But also in the IT part, protection is buying firewalls, having IT security in place. And so on every aspect within your organization, you can look at how do we want to use security, or how do we want to keep our staff safe and secure? Because the last step is deterrence, showing that if you attack us, we will attack back. Most governments use deterrence in some sense, because they will use police or military to show if you attack us, we will attack back. NGOs and also local NGOs mostly use for 80% acceptance and 20% protection, and deterrence is most of the time hard. One thing an NGO can do as a deterrent is saying, all right, if you attack us, we're going to leave. And then, well, you don't have fresh drinking water anymore, or you don't have the first aid or the hospital anymore. It's most of the time the only deterrence an NGO has. So focusing on acceptance and protection is most of the time the strategy NGOs use. Going from your context to your risk assessment, we have to discuss what is risk and how do we calculate it. Very shortly, risk is impact times probability. So the impact, the extent of what would happen if the risk materialized, and how likely the risk or event or condition is to occur. Sometimes we say probability is a threat, a malicious or negative event, times the vulnerability. So how exposed am I or is our organization to this threat? So if we want to look at what are the risks and how do we calculate them, we have a 9-step model to do the risk assessment. First, we want to make a list or identify the threats. What are the threats to our organization? What are the threats we see? And we want to rank them. And then we're going to look at, but who is where and when vulnerable? And if we know this, then we can rate the probability. What is the probability of it about to happen? And what is the impact of, well, this threat materializing, of this happening? And then we say we can calculate the gross risk. So the risk we have without us doing anything. After that, we are going to define the risk reduction measures or the risk mitigation measures. How are we going to deal with this risk? And then we can calculate the netto risk. So after we've taken those measures. And if we know the netto risk, we can rank them again to see what is our top 1 risk and our 2 and our 3, so that we know which we have to, well, look out the most. And then the 9th step is decide if it is an acceptable risk. Do we accept this risk as an organization, or do we say, well, this risk is too high, we are not going to do this project, we are not going to go? Or maybe you say it's a very high risk, but we're still going to go because it's so important that we do this. An acceptable risk. An example of such a risk assessment is a table like this, where you put the threat there, the vulnerability. Some people use the 1 to 5, very low to very high as well for the vulnerability. Not necessary for the calculation. However, for probability and impact it is, because then you're going to do probability times impact and to see how high the gross risk is. However, this is hard and there are difficulties quantifying impact or probability. So some organizations use, well, different methods of, well, calculating this. This is an example of saying, all right, what is the probability and impact? It's not really important which system you use, as long as it is consistent and that you write it down. How are we going to calculate the risks? Because then people know what your risk assessment means. Otherwise, it's very unclear what your risk assessment means. So you can say probability in green, it's less than 1 times a year, or with impact, you can make another decision. And then you calculate the gross risk. But how do we mitigate risk? How do we deal with it? There are 4 major ones, which is reducing, avoiding, transferring, and accepting. Well, reducing is trying to reduce the risk as much as possible. So, for example, with a car accident, trying to reduce the risk for car accident, you say, all right, we're going to lower our speed. We're going to use airbags or put on our seatbelts. When avoiding, you say, we are going to avoid this risk completely. So maybe if you don't want to get in a car accident, we stay at home. Then there is the transferring of the risk, which means, well, the best example there is insurance companies. We pay a little sum of money every month, and then they have the risk of us getting in a car accident. They have to pay the medical bills. They have to pay a new car. That's transferring of the risk. Sometimes we also transfer the risk to, well, as international NGOs to local NGOs, or the other way around, because the risk for foreigners is higher than for locals, or the other way around. And then the 4th one is acceptance. At some point, you'll have to accept the risk of, well, it happening, even if you try to reduce it as much as possible. And then we can extend the table like this. So in this case, the road traffic accidents, we have actions to mitigate the risks, and then the netto risk is still a certain amount. And then we can decide, do we still think that is acceptable or not? Having these risk mitigation measures, it's great. We put them in a list, but then we have to put them into procedures because we expect something from our staff, because we want to have a certain behavior that leads to these actions. So standard operating procedure is a set of written instructions that describe the step-by-step process that must be taken to properly perform the routine. And like I said, different than a risk mitigation measure, it should describe the required behavior in clear steps. So it's not only saying, I want you to drive safe in your car. No, it's also, I want you to avoid driving by night. I want you to keep to the traffic laws. I want you to not be on your mobile phone while you're driving, etc. So talking about the SOPs, we have to create and implement them in a certain way. So first we have to look at the purpose and the scope of an SOP. Do we have already such a paper ready or not? Also, why is it needed and what's the goal of us writing one? Then we're going to look at the audience. Who is it for? Because if I'm going to write an SOP in English to a staff member who does not speak English, I'm not going to get to my goal, to the purpose I have. Also, we have to look at format and writing style, because do we already have layouts within our NGO, or is that just something new? And maybe you have to discuss this. Do we put flowcharts in there, or just do we write everything out? Is there a hierarchy, or do we, don't we pay attention to the hierarchical steps there? And then we have to test it, because sometimes we think we have a wonderful plan on the table, we wrote it down perfectly, and we try it, and it's not working. So we have to test it, and it has to be tested by the end user. It has to be tested by the staff using that on a daily basis. And if we developed it and we adjusted it and we think, yes, we are ready to start using this within the organization, we have to distribute it and we have to train people on this. Some NGOs have an SOP library, so you can find all the SOPs there, or they have a security manual with all the SOPs as annexes added to it. And then again, as well with the security cycle, we have to keep reviewing and updating, because an SOP needs to be helpful while helping your staff to stay safe and secure. And if it's not working, then we should change the SOP. So we talked about context analysis. Who are you and where are you? Then we talked a little bit about risk assessment and risk reduction measures, and then formalizing them and creating an SOP. And then you did all of this work and still something bad happens. Still a crisis emerged. And then we have to start, well, before that, we have to start talking about contingency planning, because it means preparing an organization to be ready to respond effectively in the event of an emergency. So we have already to plan and to prepare the things we want to do, because if the crisis hits, we are too late. We are always 1, 2, or 3 steps behind on the crisis. However, if we already plan for a crisis to happen, we can already have a lot in place. If we look at contingency, and then crises can be very big. It can be civil war, an earthquake, also militias coming near you, war closing in on your city or your region. Then there are 3 steps. We can choose to hibernate, we can choose to relocate, or we can choose to evacuate. Hibernation is staying in the place where you are, and that can either be in the office, that can be in your own house, but the organization needs to define several places where the staff can hibernate, where the staff can stay. Sometimes it is differentiated on a local, national, international level, because in some crises, the local staff can still continue to work, or maybe in some crises, only the international staff can continue to work. Sometimes the international staff needs to respond to the embassy or needs to hibernate at the embassy. And for local and national staff, they can hibernate at home. It's all important things an organization needs to think about. Where do we hibernate? Why do we hibernate? And how do we keep our staff safe there as well? So you have to have an hibernation plan. So you put in there, well, the where, so who, and also what do we need to prepare for this? Do we need to prepare emergency supplies, like fresh drinking water, food, fuel, torches, matches, medicine, all things you might need to hibernate for maybe a week or 2 weeks, just depending on the crisis. The second option is relocation. Relocation means moving within the country. So who is going to move where and for what reason? And what do we need to prepare, again, for relocation? And then the third step is evacuation. Evacuation, that is moving across nations' borders. It's moving out of the country. And again, here, the exact same steps. Who are we going to move? Where are we going to move them? Is that safe? And what do we need to prepare for this? So you can have an easy table, to create a picture of what are we going to do? So the scenario is a civil war is starting and they try to do a coup d'etat. All right, so what is the trigger? Is the trigger already the coup d'etat, or is it the news on the radio that there are plans to do so, or is the trigger an increased military presence on the street? Your organization needs to define when the contingency plans start working and who decides it starts. And then the question is, who is included? When are we going to do this? Where, the what, and the how? And creating such an oversight can be very helpful for your organization to doing things very quickly in a very short amount of time because you already thought about it. And then the last step of the security cycle is the incident reporting. It's the monitoring of the situation, monitoring of the plans and the policies you put into place. So there are a couple of things that are important for incident reporting because every NGO does it in a different way because your communication systems are different. First of all, is have an accessible system. Can all the staff easily access an incident reporting system? And either that is a IT system on itself, maybe it's an internal SharePoint, maybe it's a WhatsApp group, but is there an accessible system to report incidents and to whom? Because most of the time people are scared to report incidents because that means most of the time they made a mistake themselves. However, it's so important that incidents reporting come in because you can build up your case. If I get called by an NGO and they ask me, all right, we need 4x4s, and me as a manager is like, why? Because it's going perfectly fine. Never had an incident report in the last 3 years. So why would I need to buy 4x4s? And then all of a sudden they say, oh no, but we already had 23 car accidents in the last 6 months. And I'm like, why didn't you tell me? I need to know this. Because if I knew there were already 20 accidents, we didn't even have the discussion on why to buy new cars. Then the action plan would already be, we are going to buy the 4x4s. So also the incident reporting builds up your case as local staff, as national staff, also as international staff traveling. And then there is the part of don't make it a punishment culture. If people are reporting this, that's already a big step. If they also get punished for the reports they make, that is very counterproductive and people will report less and less and less. And then at some point, the incidents need to be evaluated because remember, with the security cycle, we need to improve our SOPs, our policies. So we have to learn from our incidents and do it better the next time. So incident reporting and monitoring is essential for the security cycle to keep working and to keep your staff and, well, guests safe, working with you and trying to improve it every time you go back on the road, back up to your projects, that they know, we improved this the last time, or we shared information with the other organizations and we know we have to avoid route A because there are some carjacks, so we can now use route B. These 6 steps of the security cycle, so context analysis, risk assessment, risk mitigation measures, SOPs, contingency planning, and incident reporting. Those are the 6 steps that are essential to build up a security culture, to build up a security risk management framework. If you want to have more information or you have questions, always feel free to email me, Steven@globalriskadvice.com, or my colleague Jacob, and we are going to look for an answer with you. Thank you so much for your attention, making it to the end of this e-learning, and I hope we gave you a little bit more of information about security risk management, how you can do it, how you can implement it within your organization, and that it might keep you safe and secure. Thank you so much.